thank you for joining us. We're not sure if you were, we actually didn't see your name, so we're not sure if you were here already, but thank you so much for joining us today. Very much appreciated. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this high-level panel of experts on the AU theme of the year on silencing the guns within the context of internal displacement in Africa. This webinar is brought to you by the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement in Africa, GENIDA for short, in collaboration with the Center for Human Rights, the University of Pretoria. GENIDA is an international collaboration between the University of Pretoria and the University of London that seeks to respond to the policy and research gaps with respect to the issue of internal displacement in Africa. Now, I'd really like to welcome everyone warmly to this pertinent webinar and of course our distinguished experts, keynote presenter and our esteemed panelists for taking out time from their busy schedule to really attend this pertinent occasion. I'd like to thank them, particularly also for knowing how busy they are and how tremendously they have contributed to the issues that we're discussing today. I really like to thank them for also taking out time to be here and share with us critical insights. As we may very well know, the issue of internal displacement has become a significant challenge in Africa. Conflict principally drives this issue. At least we have about 12.5 million people who have been displaced due to conflict on the continent. Hence, it has become important to begin to critically reflect on strategies for preventing conflict, which principally drives internal displacement and forced displacement much more generally in Africa. And it is really against this backdrop that the discussion of this webinar is of significance. Today we have, as Elian mentioned, we have seasoned panelists, high-profile experts here with us who have graciously taken out their time to grace this occasion. And would begin this morning with a keynote presentation from Professor Gilbert Khadiagala on perspectives on silencing the guns beyond 2020. My sincere apologies for the error in the title, and many thanks to Professor Gilbert for graciously bringing this to our attention. The title of his presentation is Perspectives on Silencing the Guns Beyond 2020, so looking beyond this year, going forward. Professor Khadiagala is the Jan Smuts Professor of International Relations at the University of Witwatersrand, and he's also the director of the African Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand. He's a high-profile scholar, and indeed one that has extremely done tremendous work in Africa, African security, conflict resolution, governance, leadership, and also of particular importance to our webinar today. Professor Khadiagala has significantly done a lot of extensive work on the issue of silencing the guns in Africa. And I also humbly invite you to read his distinguished works. And of course, of note in more recent years is classical text on war and peace in Africa's Great Lakes region. It's an honor to have you here with us, Professor Khadiagala. You'll be speaking to us for about 20 minutes. Afterwards, we'll move into a brief question and answer for about 10 minutes. But please note that you'd still have time to ask him questions should you not be able to ask within the first 10 minutes. So you'd ask questions following the presentations today. Afterwards, we'd have keynote presenters. After our keynote presentation, we'd have an eminent panel of experts on preventing conflict and forced displacement in Africa. And we'd begin with Dr. Alehone Muligeta Bebe, who amongst many other excellent things is a senior legal officer at the African Union, also working with the UNHCR. And for those of us who have done extensive research on the issue of internal displacement, I'm sure his name rings a significant bell, given his extensive scholarly work on forced displacement, including his seminal text on the emerging law on forced displacement in Africa, specifically also reflected on the Kampala Convention, which was published by Routledge, and such a very brilliant text. And I would also invite you to look at it if you're yet to read it, given his insightful analysis. And Dr. Alehone will be speaking to us about making preventive and solution strategies for conflict-related internal displacement more effective. And afterwards, after his presentation, we'll be having a significant insight from Dr. Walter Summer, who is the head of cell mission analysis at AMISOM. And I must say that Dr. Walters has done extensive work also, having gained significant experience and understanding, not least, of course, in Africa, but very importantly also within Somali context and also within the context of Central Africa, but he's really done extensive work, both as an academic previously, but then now working on the policy and strategic direction perspective. And Dr. Walters comes with significant experience and knowledge, and he will be speaking to us about implementing the AU's Silence in the Guns agenda in Somalia and its impact on internally displaced persons. And afterwards, we'll have Ms. Angelique Sam, who is the Regional IDP Advisor, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and also a seasoned expert, having done significant work and policy around the issue of conflict and of internal displacement, of humanitarian law, and also within this significant ambit of the work that is being done by the ICRC in Africa and of course beyond. And following this presentation, we'll be having Dr. Japheth Bigon, who is the Regional Advocacy Coordinator for Africa at Amnesty International, and also a seasoned expert, and in fact, one that has done tremendous work and is an erudite scholar on the issue of Africa human rights protection, but more importantly as well, conflict and on the issue of displacement. And he will be speaking to us about justice and accountability as critical elements in silencing the guns. So we really want to thank our distinguished panelists for really making up time and for being here today. And without further ado, I'd like to humbly call upon Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, who would be delivering his keynote presentation on perspectives on silencing the guns beyond 2020. Professor Khadiagala, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to appreciate your presence today, wherever you are, because I think this is an important topic that I think deserves a lot of attention. And it's also an opportune moment to address the issue of silencing the guns beyond 2020, because we are actually in 2020 now and we are ending 2020. So I'm excited to be part of the discussion. But I'm also privileged to speak about this topic today because last Sunday, the African Union heads of state had a virtual meeting where they discussed the issue of silencing the guns and where to go from here. So I think some of what came out of that deliberations is going to be important in my at the very end of my presentation, to reflect very briefly on what is the meaning of silencing the guns beyond 2020. My presentation is divided in three parts. A summary of the main points that I had in my May 2015 paper on silencing the guns, strengthening governance to prevent, manage, and resolve conflicts in Africa. And the moderator has already alluded to it. So I thought what I'll do is to, in fact, give a very brief overview of what I was trying to say in that paper, particularly for people who haven't read it. And then what I'll do secondly is to examine why the objectives of silencing the guns have yet to be met, even though we are here in 2020. That means I'll be talking about what did we do wrong, and what are the implications therefore for the future. Finally, I'll reflect on where we need to go in reshaping the agenda of reducing violent conflicts in Africa. So those are the three parts. So to begin on my first part, which is a reflection on my paper on silencing the guns. This paper was published in 2015, but it was part of a larger discussion that the African Union, the Department of Political Affairs, under the leadership of Dr. Habele Matlosa, had initiated in 2013, immediately after the silencing the guns agenda was articulated by the AU. So I was asked to help in thinking through what are the governance dimensions of silencing the guns. So we had a lot of discussions between 2013 into 2014, particularly at the high level AU meetings on governance in Africa. But this paper only got published in 2015, long after the discussions had begun. So what did I try to do in this paper? I said three things. The first thing was silencing the guns was primarily a governance problem. What did that mean? Governance essentially means how to build institutions at national, regional, and continental level. Institutions that are in the business of promoting the common good. Institutions that are in the business of managing public affairs for the welfare of everybody. So I think that was the key conception of governance that allowed me to begin to look at how do you silence the guns while building steady and steady governance institutions. Governance was also, I argued, related to issues around how does Africa build prosperous societies. So prosperity was important as a governance issue. Security was also important. And finally, dignity was also important. So I argued that these are really the pillars of governance, the prosperity, security, and dignity that were encompassed in the goals of building institutions by nations, sub-regions, and the continental level. And I argued that, in fact, these were the primary pillars of Africa's independence. That's what we wanted from day one, how to build functional and prosperous and secure societies. And it was captured also in the Agenda 2063, which said we need to build more comfortable, more prosperous Africa going forward. So that's why I put the agenda of governance at the heart of silencing the guns. Secondly, what I said in that paper was, despite the many obstacles, Africa has made a lot of progress already towards building institutions of governance. And we saw this, I argued, from the 90s, the second wave of Africa's so-called independence was a wave of building democratic governing institutions. So that as Africa was steadily embarking on the process of democratic governance in the 90s, Africa was drawing from the many templates, the many formulas, the platforms, the common sense, and the determination to end conflicts through the promotion of the rule of law, human rights, popular participation, and the management of diversity. So that by the time we proclaim silencing the guns in 2013, we're already on the road to building democratic institutions. We are already committed to building the rule of law. And we are already committed, therefore, to managing diversity more peacefully. And I was arguing this is important because we already know where we want to go. We should not be reinventing the wheel of silencing the guns, because this was already an African agenda. So that the goal of ending wars, I argued, just needed some kind of generational and intergenerational rejuvenation. These are things that were already being done. Africa was already on the path towards how to rebuild good societies. The determination of good societies was therefore an African value. Thirdly, I said in that paper that although the time frame for ending violent conflicts, for silencing the guns was very short, 7 years, because we started this in 2013, and we are thinking of 2012, 2020, so only 7 years. I argued the time frame was very limited and probably unrealistic. But the goal of silencing the gun to me was two things. One, it was aspirational. What did that mean? It meant we should work towards it and not get discouraged. We should aspire towards this very big objective, which is going to contribute to the regeneration and to the rejuvenation of Africa. Secondly, it was not just aspirational, it was also inspirational. What did that mean? The goal of ending guns, silencing guns, gave us the confidence. It gave us more energy, more conviction towards that very noble objective of silencing the guns. So I said, therefore, if you combine those two components, the aspirational and the inspirational, what you did find was the very, very document that the African Union had propounded in 2011 called Strengthening Regional Integration Through Shared Values. So when we discovered silencing the guns in 2013, it was not really a new discovery. We had already committed since 2011 to shared values as Africans. So the goal of silencing the gun was a new shared value, and we should do it because we had the resources, we had the resolve, and we had the determination to do it. And you remember that the shared values agenda was articulated in January 2011 at the very time when the Arab Spring was unfolding. So it gave us more impetus, therefore, to begin, when we talked about silencing the guns, it gave us the impetus to begin to think that this goal is achievable within 7 years, even though 7 years was a very short time. So what happened then to these noble objectives? And I'm now on my second part of the presentation. Where did we go wrong? I think in evaluating the failures to silence the guns, we should start from the premise that I articulated in the 2015 paper, which was to understand a conflict-free Africa, or to understand how to build a conflict-free Africa, we must have very frank and very honest dialogues, frank and honest debates about where we go wrong, about the prevalence and the persistence of conflicts. Because often when we have these discussions, we tend to go into denial mode. We tend to make a lot of excuses. We tend to hide in the sand. So my argument is that we should have a very brutal discussion about what went wrong. And I think if we do that, we'll be contributing to the honesty that is critical really to beginning to problem solve, particularly around where did we go wrong. So I don't think we need to go to look far than the Mo Ibrahim report on governance that was just released about a few weeks ago, which paints a very bleak picture of the African governance landscape. I think that to me is a good way to start in saying that we have failed, because the Mo Ibrahim report is saying from participation to accountability, Africa is failing to live up to the minimum expectations of well-governed societies. It is failing to live up to the basic expectations of a well-governed continent. Corruption is up, not down. Despite monumental investments in anti-corruption institutions, there's no progress on that front. And if we don't make progress on anti-corruption, how are we going to get the resources that would enable us to begin addressing the broader silent guns agenda? The Mo Ibrahim report says that in 2019, African governance performance declined for the first time in a decade because of declines in participation, declines in human rights, declines in the objectives of inclusion, security, and human development. And I think that's a very good summary of what the problem is. So these declines, therefore, have gradually accumulated, he argues, since 2015. So just about the time we are declaring that we are going to silencing the guns, that is the time when we are beginning very steady declines in the very governance components that I'm arguing are key to silencing the guns. So we see the declines in these rights, we see the declines in democratic space, accounting largely for the resurgence of unconstitutionalism, political lawlessness, and intolerance that is now part of African political landscape. We have seen this trend recently in the unconstitutional changes in government, the changes in constitutions, presidents re-electing themselves. All these are things that we thought were part of the old regime mentality of the 80s and the 70s. We've seen in Guinea, in Cote d'Ivoire, and many other places, even before Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire, the presidential term limits being willy-nilly disrespected. As a result, we are seeing the return of electoral authoritarianism. And across Africa, elections we thought were going to usher a new era of generational change, of renewal of leadership. But we are now going back to the dark days of electoral authoritarianism. And we saw that in places like Tanzania very recently. I mean, a country that we thought had a legacy of democratic participation, despite the one-party dominance in that country. Now, Tanzania is reverting to essentially a country that is not as well governed as we should have expected. And if we find countries like Tanzania failing in governance, then who should we be looking up to? We see the current trend in Uganda, ongoing campaigns, ongoing violence in the streets as Uganda prepares for its January elections. So these are worrying trends that are captured in most of what we are calling the declines in governance. And then just across the border from Tanzania, you have the DRC, which is now in a permanent state of political paralysis. So how can we expect to silence the guns in the greater Great Lakes region without a stable and without a Congo that is comfortable with itself? And we see a very worrying trend in that country, probably leading us into another era of ungovernability, which will be a very dangerous trend for the region and for Africa as a whole. Every time, therefore, Africa reverts to the bad old days of misgovernance, intolerance, and authoritarianism, there is a predictable return to civil conflicts, to ethnic violence. And this is what we are beginning to see currently. These are factors that prevent the silencing of the guns. So when we look at the Sahel, a region that we thought was recovering from difficult periods of the early 90s, when we see a region like the Horn of Africa, which at some point we thought was going to recover from political lawlessness and threats of irredentism and so on, we see the return to the bad old days of political and ethnic strife. Of course, terrorist organizations are thriving on that background of intolerance, mismanagement of diversity, and so on. That's why the Al-Shabaabs of this world, the Boko Harams of this world, continue to thrive and continue to destabilize large parts of Africa. And how are we going to silence the guns in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa if we see the return to the old patterns? And as we see, the recent conflict in Ethiopia illustrates very well draconian approaches to conflict resolution are only going to inflame passions and deepen political polarization, in fact, leading to further strife and further wars in that part of the world, which is a very fragile part of Africa, and it doesn't need any more conflicts. And that is why I think the current conflict between Ethiopia and Tigray is an unfortunate conflict and is going to postpone efforts to recreate order and therefore to silence the guns in that critical part of the world. I think we should also attribute the failures of silencing guns not just to failures in national governance structures, but also to regional governance structures. In 2011, we promised ourselves that we should forge more shared values, particularly within our sub-regional context, and that we should find more ways of working together on security issues, on economic issues, on political issues within our sub-regions. But we could not do that without a sense of shared values. I think that's why the shared values agenda was very critical to silencing the guns. Currently, therefore, the regional economic communities are much weaker, much more weaker than before, because we have never invested in them as institutions that are going to help transform our multiple approaches to our very multiple problems. And that's why I think I will need to keep going back to the issue that without functional regional institutions in Africa, and I'm not talking about the AU, I'm talking about sub-regional institutions that are close to more geographically cohesive. We need to have the return to these structures, because they are the structures of common values and common belongingness. If we don't invest in them, we might as well give up on the objective of silencing the guns. We need to get back, therefore, to the agenda of regional integration anchored on shared sovereignties, on shared values, not just integration for integration's sake, which I think is a current trend. The rates were supposed to be the fountains of shared values. They were supposed to be the fountains of peace and security in Africa, but they have failed. And we need to be very honest about how to remake them so that they fit the purpose for which we want them to work. So where do we go from here? Last Sunday's meeting of the AU, fortunately, they did not blame COVID-19 for the failure of the silencing the guns agenda. But what they did was to say, we need to extend the deadline for silencing the guns by another 10 years. So we had 2030 is a new deadline. And I think this was a profound mistake. If we have not done it in 7 years, how do we actually do it if we just add another 10 years? This becomes a game of numbers, a game of years, and I don't think it's a serious approach to the problem. My suggestion is very simple. A more realistic time frame that we should adopt is one that realigns the peace and security priorities of silencing the guns with the development agenda of 2063. So instead of separating peace and security as objectives that can just be achieved willy-nilly within 10 years, we should actually say, why don't we go back to the drawing board? Why don't we realign the 2063 agenda as part of the bigger umbrella for African aspirations? So I think the 2063 is a better year for rethinking the issue of silencing the guns. And I think this is what we should have done rather than just propose a new artificial deadline of 2030. I can understand the anxiety to end violent conflicts before we can realistically meet the multiple goals of Agenda 2063. But I think adding another 10 years to silencing the guns is fairly unproductive and unhelpful. 2063 gives us a wider time frame and enough room to go back to the drawing board and deliberate on the governance failures that drive the escalation of violence in Africa, drive intolerance and weak regional institutions. So I'm actually suggesting that what we need to do is to go back to the original conception of how do we actually silence the guns? And the only way to do that is therefore to go back to the conception of what are the governance requirements that would permit us to actually begin thinking more seriously about silencing the guns. And for this, we don't need a new artificial time frame. We need a longer one that is very consistent with the broader African objectives of a prosperous and a secure future. And that is what is encompassed in Agenda 2063. I think, ladies and gentlemen, I should stop here for now and maybe take some questions. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to reflect on silencing the guns beyond 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Khadiagala. That was an excellent presentation, and thank you so much for giving us very pertinent things to think about. It's very interesting that you mentioned that what we really need is to think through how to realign the peace and security agenda of silencing the guns with the developmental agenda of Agenda 2063. And I think it's a pertinent reflection you've given there. Thank you so much. I do see that there are questions and, in fact, significant interactions from our esteemed participants. And I'll just only like to call on those who would like to ask questions. If you would like to ask questions, could you just kindly indicate by using the hand button to indicate that you'd like to ask questions, I would call on you. Please kindly use the raise your hand button, and then we'll call on you. Right, I do see that we have one question here in the chat button, and probably if you'd like to ask questions as well, if you're having difficulties raising your hand in the button provided within the box, you could probably just indicate by sending a chat into that regard. I do see we have one question here, and the question is from BL. BL, you've asked that that you'd like to know what are African organizations thinking about, what is Africa, or what are African organizations thinking about the insurgent attacks in the Cabo Delgado province in Mozambique. And I suppose you're speaking to a specific context and probably also asking how the issues could be resolved. And I do see also, Mr. Chan, you had asked that is there a model that African states can follow in order to better manage this diversity, particularly in view of the fact that many interstate conflicts in Africa are hugely as a result of a call for more representation and recognition by certain groups and the reaction of the state to that call? Thank you for that question. And I think on this note, I'll just like to briefly call upon Professor Khadiagala to ask, but please, if you to answer the questions, but if you have other questions, please kindly make use of the chat button and also indicate by raising your hand, and we'll call on you. Thank you. Professor Khadiagala, you have the floor.
Thank you for those questions. I think the first question is on Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, where we have an insurgent movement with Islamic ties or radical Islamic ties beginning to destabilize that part of the world. What I think I want to do is to put that the Cabo Delgado problem in the context of a larger problem which we saw in places like Nigeria, Boko Haram, we've seen in Somalia on Al-Shabaab. These are insurgent movements that assume religious overtones to begin to address grievances that actually exist within the larger socio-political and economic horizon. And therefore, I think it is easier to have a very clear answer that says, these are problems of political marginalization. These are problems of states that are incapable of addressing the problems in their periphery. Cabo Delgado, if you recall clearly, is very far from Maputo. But Maputo, as a state, has taken very little interest that underlie the insurgency in that part of Mozambique. So predictably, the insurgents are thriving not just on local grievances, but they also thrive where the state barely has any presence. The only presence the state has there is a very weak military. So the question therefore is, how do you resolve that conflict before it escalates into a Boko Haram kind of problem or a Al-Shabaab kind of problem? The issue is, it is not too late to engage the insurgents. It is not too late for the Mozambican state to show its governance credentials by going back into that region and beginning to think through what are the root causes of that insurgency. I think militarizing that conflict is only going to make it worse. So I'm saying, therefore, that we need to look at insurgent movements as a problem of states failing to address the underlying problems within those very regions. And the more they ignore these problems, the more, in fact, they flare up. And this is what we are now seeing. So what needs to be done? I think we put that responsibility on the Mozambican government. And I think we say it is your responsibility as a national actor to make sure that your household is in order. But Mozambique has also shown that probably doesn't have as much capacity. So there is no reason why SADC or the neighboring countries cannot help, in fact, in dealing with some aspects of that problem. But my good response is to say, you don't want to militarize it forever, because that's not really going to resolve that problem. So SADC has a role, but we have to be very careful what kind of role is it going to assume in a very delicate situation. I therefore counsel for a good judicious balance between negotiations and more trying to marginalize the more hardline elements of that group. But I think ultimately we can reach a negotiated solution to that problem once there are people who can stand up and who can be counted and who can be, in fact, asked to take responsibility, because ultimately this is a responsibility that we need to take up. And we don't really want more violence, whether in Boko Haram area, whether in Somalia or in Mozambique. I think we are striving all for peace. The second question was on the nature of regional organizations and their contribution to the questions around peace and security in Africa. I made the point in my presentation that I was going to focus largely on sub-regional institutions, the SADC, the East African Community, ECOWAS. I didn't want to speak about the AU deliberately, because I have always believed that the AU is an umbrella organization that sets the rules, that does so much to make sure that Africa is well governed. But the AU has a lot of limits, bureaucratic, but also the AU is ultimately answerable to member states. So I've always tried to argue that we should not give too much attention to what happens at that level in Addis Ababa. I think what we should be focused on is to what extent do we make sub-regional organizations more responsible and more responsive to the kinds of problems within their sub-regional settings. And I've always argued that if we have functional sub-regional organizations, then we'll have a much more functional AU, and not the other way around. So I don't really believe that the AU has excellent principles on unconstitutional change of government, values, the shared values, all these things we're talking about articulated by the African Union. But the limits it faces are profound. And therefore, we should lay responsibility on the kind of co-actors where there is more synergy, where there is more cohesiveness, and where probably there could be more traction. And that is why in my presentation, I kept referring to what happened to the shared values at sub-regional levels. Because if you talk about democracy promotion, you can do it within sub-regional contexts. The more you go further out to the AU, the more messier it becomes. So we should focus on how we rebuild these institutions. But I've argued, as I said in my presentation, we can't build regional institutions without thinking about shared sovereignties. We talk a lot about this, but we don't implement. We like to go to summits and talk, but we don't like to share sovereignty because that's a more difficult issue. And I think we should do it because Africa's future lies in we working together within our own cohesive sub-regional context. And then we can bring in other sub-regions like we are going to do with the Continental Free Trade Area. Why not? Why not? Because this can be done, but it has to be built from up, from down up, from the ground. And by the ground, I mean from sub-regional context. What I also don't want to do is to be too much pessimistic about these institutions. I've given up on being pessimistic because my point is we need to make these institutions work for us. And if we don't, then we are lost. So I don't want to claim that I'm just complaining. I'm saying we need good debates about how to strengthen our institutions, because this is where our future lies. It doesn't lie anywhere. It doesn't lie with our narrow nation states. We have to work more towards building these institutions, but we also have to be optimistic about what they can do and realistic about what they can do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for that excellent summation of the realities on the continent. And I do see that we do have a plethora of questions coming in from our distinguished participants. I'll just probably take 2 questions and then have us probably move to the next session, and then we could take the rest of the questions after this session. So the first question I'll take would be from Mr. Mathieu. I think you had asked that how do we appreciate the progress and outcomes of this agenda before the end of 2020? So pretty much looking at how do we appreciate the progress on how we've come in terms of silencing the guns. And he also asked that why guns and fire in Africa, who are responsible for the gunfires? I think it's just a question around knowing who to hold accountable within this particular context. And I do see another pertinent question from Ms. Eskeda, that what other democratic routes do you see other than the so-called democratic elections within the continent, which usually end up in satisfying the interests of authoritarian incumbents, and also citing recent examples on the continent that we could probably reflect on in this context. And I think, Mrs. Keda, you had cited Guinea, Tanzania, and also reflecting on Uganda in January. These are pertinent questions that have come up, but I do see that there was another question specifically on Ethiopia that I'd perhaps like to flag, which is how can we consider the law enforcement operations of the Ethiopian government in the Tigray region in this context, perhaps as probably following the conflicts. I do see that question from Mr. Dereji on that particular note. So I would say that if you do have questions, we would, please do feel free to put it in the chat box and we'll take them after, but we'll just probably ask Professor to kindly reflect on these few questions quite briefly. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you again. I'll reflect more very quickly because maybe we need to move on. But the issue of progress is what kind of progress did we make in 7 years? A very good question. I think we are complaining about the problem areas because the problem areas often tend to overwhelm the good stories. So I think what we are saying is that unless you have stability in most of these regions, even countries that are doing fairly well. I mean, like we're just reading, for instance, this week, Ghana is holding very peaceful elections in a region where you've had in Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, and so on, you know, very contested elections. So how, I mean, the stories of Ghana and so on, the more positive stories are reinforcing the theme of well-governed societies. Why are they well-governed? Because they are adhering to some of the principles, basic principles that we are talking about. How do you manage diversity? How do you create more accountable institutions? So there is progress because there are countries that are actually doing well. But as I said, in this context, we want to keep complaining. We want to keep embarrassing those countries that are doing poorly because if they don't do well, then all of us are not going to do well. So I think that's how I respond to the notion of progress. Where are the guns coming from? I mean, this is an age-old story on, I mean, is it guns or is it people that are causing conflict? And the question is, I think, is both. Africa doesn't produce a lot of these weapons. We still get them from without. But the question we need to ask is, why are we getting these weapons when we should actually be focusing on other things, on the economic dividends and so on? And I think in the original paper, I made the point about, we need a few Costa Ricas in Africa. We need countries that have no armies. And why can't we work towards that? Because we can. If we want to silence the guns, we can commit to working together without having armies, especially in countries like this region where there are small countries with armies that are simply too idle. And we can work towards it if we work collectively. On the issues of democratic systems, I think there are many variations to the democratic space or to the democratic dream. And the way we've resolved this is to say different countries, because of their distinctiveness, may have different electoral systems. And this has been the global story. A lot of countries with very diverse electoral systems, but they still go back to the same dream of, how do we find more participatory mechanisms? How do we find more accountable mechanisms? How do we find more responsive political systems? So electoral systems can be re-engineered according to context and cultures, but we should be focused on, I think, what I'm calling the puzzle of how do we build good societies if we do more in terms of just creating more participatory space, more accountable institutions, and so on. I think that's the way to look at it. On Ethiopia, quickly, it's a difficult issue. We need, my point was that for outsiders, we need an Ethiopia that is stable. We need an Ethiopia that is grappling with bigger problems, like negotiating with the Egyptians. We need an Ethiopia that provides leadership on bigger issues of the Horn of Africa. We don't need an Ethiopia that is lapsing back into civil war. So that was my bigger point, that we should do more to make sure that, in fact, stability returns to that part of the world, because there are more urgent and more difficult issues that we need Ethiopian leadership on. That was my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those excellent points, Professor Khadiagala. I think you've really given us a summation of how far we've come, but then how far we need to go as well on the continent. And I do see that there are more questions. And thank you so much to our distinguished participants that have sent in questions. Please note that we would take these questions right after our professor would still be with us, and we would be sure to answer. We'd be sure to read your questions, and of course, he would answer them as well. Thank you for that. Yeah. Yes, and without further ado, I'd like to move on to our first presentation from our distinguished panelist, Dr. Alehoni Muligeta, a baby who would be speaking about making preventive and solution strategies for conflict-related internal displacement more effective. And I would call on Dr. Abebe to please take the floor. Thank you so much, Dr. Abebe, and a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, participants and organizers. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the colleagues who are doing the slides to present the slides on the screen, please. Thank you very much. It's such a joy to be back to my alma mater, my university, where I graduated master's program 17 years ago. That is a long time. That shows the incredible community that this center has built over the years, and it's always good to get the occasion to go back and reflect on issues that really concern us all. And I'm so delighted to be a part of this conversation. Currently, I am working with the AU, seconded by UNHCR. I've been in this position for the last 3 years. And it's also really encouraging. I mean, Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, he sets out a very reality in the continent, but also there is so much hope, as he concluded. That's what he mentioned, and that we as Africans are debating largely issues that really concerns the continent and its people. This shows there were some not even managed by African themselves. So it's good that we are discussing both at the political level, but also in this kind of forum. And that's exactly what's also happening on the street and the universities in different countries. Just to say that I would like to focus on what happens when conflicts emerge in Africa. Usually people get displaced and get uprooted, unfortunately. And I want to highlight what these displacement situations say about governance or its crisis, and the kind of hope also they give if they are managed properly in solving and addressing actually bigger pictures, bigger issues like conflict themselves. Currently, we have 19.2 million internally displaced people in Africa, more than 7.8 million refugees and asylum seekers. That is more than 25 million people. And it's a mid-sized African country. It's a very large. And now we are not even talking about those who are trapped in conflict situations, who are not able to move or, to safer areas. And also those who are hosting those displaced population, be it IDPs or refugees. And displacement is very interesting and at the heart of this discussion on silencing the guns or political processes, just because it really reveals the governance failures around governance, a breakdown of trust among communities, the collapse of social contract in society. Everywhere you see major displacement, there is significant challenge when it comes to governance, human rights, development deficit. So there is a lot we gain by looking at the displacement pattern in the continent and how we can solve these practical problems. If we manage governance, we can build back. We can create people-centered efforts to recover better, build peace that matters to people at the local level, support solutions and returns of those who are displaced. Of course, this is a difficult journey, but in fact, what we are going to look at is in Africa, the picture is rather very encouraging because there are impressive institutional, political, and very practical initiatives that have borne fruit. Of course, the challenge is immense. And so I want to highlight what I call the few ingredients of effective prevention and solutions on internal displacement, but they are pretty much linked to broader solutions in addressing conflicts and other crises. The first is really the need to create visibility, making people who have been so invisible being seen. For many years, government denied that the internet crisis is an issue of interest to international community, but that has stopped now. In fact, African governments have created the first binding legal instruments and mandating the role of the AU in this regard, and REX, and acknowledging the role of international organizations, such as my mother institution, which is UNHCR, and ICRC and others. And so this shows that governments are ready to establish some visibility. And of course, when it comes to country-specific issues, there may be challenges. But I think the progress in this area is very much important. The second issue that I want to highlight for this successful way of managing internal displacement is also facilitating effective and meaningful participation of displaced people. When we talk about political processes, we only talk about diplomats and what they can do, or member states, but what about people who are affected? What are those, how do we empower the most vulnerable, those who are at the receiving ends of conflicts? And how can we unleash the potential of those groups, not only just in giving handouts, but really making them a part of broader solutions? The third important point that I would like to highlight briefly is also the centrality of human rights, often, especially nowadays, as a human rights student myself, it's a very difficult environment globally, not just in Africa, but globally, to talk about human rights. And I think because of the crisis in multilateral institutions, the challenge, the United Nations system and regional institutions are in terms of really changing geopolitical patterns. This has really put a lot of pressure on human rights. But it's in human rights values, I think we see even the solutions, even the future. And it's good, I'm very much impressed by how Professor Gilbert really focused on the issue of governance and democracy to address some of the root causes for, in implementing the silencing of the guns agenda, for instance. Built on these governance and democratic solutions is the issue of human rights. Of course, we can't talk about good governance, we can't talk about democracy without talking about the centrality of human rights. And then the fourth point is, of course, support to national ownership and capacity. Ultimately, again, the keynote speaker has clearly outlined that government need to own, need to be responsible. But of course, in conflict situation, government can be a source of the problem as well. They are a part of a conflict party. In this case, how do you enhance and strengthen, national ownership? So when we talk about national ownership, we're not necessarily talking about government ownership. And how can we build capacity at different levels? And then, of course, in bigger, massive crises, governments have limited capacity, in which case the role of regional and international support. This is the next slide is just a kind of how to visualize all these elements as my colleagues at UNHCR has beautifully put this together, and to show you how, when you respond to internal displacement, what are the different elements. And even there you see how whatever we invest early on in a displacement response can really help us also build trust, build solutions, build, improve democratic governance, and write a new social contract between affected communities and the governments. Let me just briefly come to the issue of how to make IDPs visible. Again, Professor Gilbert was talking about rejuvenation of Africa. I mean, these are very grand words, but I think he has really helped us to see clearly what it means. It means it should really matter to those kind of people we're talking about, those who are affected by crises, and including IDPs. That's why I'm rather encouraged, for instance, by the level of innovation at the AU and the African Regional Policy and Political Initiative on IDPs. This is now being showcased even as best examples. The willingness at the regional level to really create a space for this issue to be acknowledged. And an example being, Africa is currently the only regional space where you have a binding international regional binding instrument on IDPs, and more than 31 countries have ratified, and some countries have already also legislated at the national level to domesticate this instrument. But making internal displacement also requires a lot of work. It's required data and information on IDPs. I participate in several conversations, including some diplomats, involving diplomats, and I can tell you this is the most contentious issue. You mentioned a number, and some countries really say, no, that's not. But no one is saying IDPs don't exist, or at least that's not the issue. The issue is about, this is. But then governments are increasingly willing to talk about the need to really do data and information on IDPs. At the moment, several countries are partnering with different organizations, UN and regional and sub-regional organizations, to develop this capacity. And the very important point, use of this data and information is actually really, once you have a clear data, governments will be encouraged to really give political recognition to this problem. And you can mobilize political action, and you take measures at different levels to make sure that IDPs are included. And that's why I think visibility, once people are invisible, nobody's going to talk about them. When you have numbers, when you have names, when you have clear data, that's when political recognition starts. This, of course, is a very difficult exercise, and many countries suffer. And it's not just, some countries, even the national civilian registration system itself, 7%, 10% of the people have access to these basic registration systems, let alone those who are in conflict situation. That's why there is a high level increasing capacity at the international level to support governments, like, for example, UNHCR, IOM, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, the joint, initiatives on, a profiling service, and all this kind of capacities are out there for governments. That the aim is really to create visibility. When we talk about conflict, when we talk about silencing the guns agenda, when we talk about the need to create a human-centered, people-centered initiative, we have to mention people. We have to have the data. Who is being affected by conflict, and this is very critical area of increased investment, and there are resources, and there are some positive and examples. Then the next issue is really, what about, how do we put human rights protection at the center of whatever support that we want to do? And I have mentioned some of the provisions in the Kampala Convention that are relevant to this. But human rights and international human rights law violations, whenever they happen, they are the early warning signs for a country in crisis. So the moment if we focus on addressing initial human rights violations, IHL crises, IHL violations, they can also serve as early warning signs. Again, how to prevent, how to silence, how to early on respond. And that's why human rights can really be important indicators for our successful interventions. Compliance with human rights and IHL is also effective prevention tools in this, but this is a very difficult area, of course. That's why we need to really support different actors like the national human rights institutions. And we have successful examples, for instance, in the case of internal displacement in Kenya, post-election violence in Kenya, in Nigeria, in Uganda, where human rights, national human rights institution, independent or relatively independent, strong national human rights institution can document, register IDPs, document response, provide compliance and reporting mechanisms, and really being at the center of response on IDPs. And these are successful examples. But this may not be always applicable in all countries, but we have positive examples. That's why we say human rights protection at the center is critical. And moving on to the next point around the support on effective participation of IDPs. Again, on the theme of the year with the African Union, and we had successful examples where we brought in IDPs to really have meaningful participation on AU processes. We normally think of the AU as only state-centered conversation happening in diplomatic corridors, and actually, when you look at closely what's happening, there are several opportunities. We had successful initiatives where we have visible role of IDPs, but the most meaningful is to have these at the national level. That's why, again, the message from Professor Gilbert is very important, especially the link with democratization. When we talk about democratization, we're not talking about just elections. We are talking about people who are affected by a certain issue having opportunity to have meaningful and effective participation. That's why IDPs, we, be it as government or international actors or as the AU or as academic institution, shouldn't simply be talking about IDPs. Let us create opportunity for them to have meaningful participation. I hope that some IDPs are involved even in this conversation. We had several initiatives, especially with the AU, where in our meetings, IDPs are involved, refugees and migrant representatives. And I think this is very important. And even recently, we have developed a study together with UN Women, UNHCR, OHCR, really looking at the AU, the political architecture and government architecture and its peace and security architecture and institution, to see to what extent these institutions involve people who are concerned. And the findings are very interesting. And now there is a draft operational guidelines even to help how to involve IDPs more in this process. Just to move on to the next two slides, I'll be sorry if I took time, but I'm finishing. How do we then support national ownership and enhance the capacity at the local level? And I think this is very important, as I mentioned, in Nigeria, for instance, in Kenya, in Niger, there are local institutions and legal processes internal displacement better. One argument that I often hear talking to government representatives, they say, conflict happens only in that country mainly. We don't have conflict. In the last 30 years, we don't have conflict, so we don't need IDP legislation. We don't need to ratify the Kampala Convention. But we need to prepare. In some of the countries that are now facing conflicts, you know, those are countries we never had conflicts for a very long time. So having those institutional setup and mechanisms and laws and policies are critical to respond and even to avert displacement. And there are some good examples in Africa. For example, in the one I mentioned in Kenya, post-election, the most comprehensive national legislation that I know government officials have gone through that training. The idea is really to start that conversation. Some of those who participate in this are champions of IDPs at national level. Some of the countries that are, so this is an example where we see the African Union really taking leadership and really using its coordination role to really promote normative standard. Just last and finally, as I said, during conflicts, the government capacity is quite limited, and government can be a source of problem. A part of the problem is a conflicting party. That's why we need more active engagement from the AU, from international organizations. The Kampala Convention, which is currently, as I said, ratified by more than 31 countries, recognize the role of the AU. Governments acknowledging that the AU has the role to intervene, and they acknowledge the international coordination mechanisms that exist. And currently, as some of you may know, the UN Secretary General has also initiated a high-level panel on IDPs, really to see how the international community can enhance its attention to this problem. And also the UN regional human rights mechanisms can also play support. So the kind of inspiration that I get from all these international and regional developments is, number one, we are not in a time, no government can now deny international concern of international community. People, governments, communities, NGOs, and the UN system increasingly see, in fact, addressing internal displacement is a way to respond to future crises and build a new form of social contract. And so the journey of the African region in the last several years, we celebrated, in fact, the 10th anniversary of the Kampala Convention last year, shows that the progress is actually very impressive, but the challenge is immense. So this is a moment for us not to lose hope, but also to build this momentum and address some of the gaps that exist. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Haliani, for such a brilliant presentation. And it's very imperative that you actually mention the centrality of norms, not least, of course, the regional norm on internal displacement, but then also human rights framework has been pertinent, but also speaking to the fact that democratic processes in Africa also we need to rethink it beyond just elections to also ensuring participation of all categories of persons involved, including internally displaced persons, very significantly. And thank you so much for also reflecting on what the AU is doing in this regard, and for giving us very pertinent and critical strategies. I do see that already there are there are participants here who would really want to ask questions around this subject. But I'll just like you to very kindly note your questions, and after this session, we will be asking. We'll be actually having the time for questions, and Dr. Alihuni would be responding to your pertinent questions in relation to the imperative discussion which he has taken us through in terms of preventive strategies and solutions for conflict-related internal displacement in Africa. And I would just like now to move on to our next presenter. Miss Angelique, are you there, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Romola. Are you hearing me well?
Yes, we are. We can hear you well. I would just kindly like to call on you to make your presentation. And thank you so much, Ms. Angelique, for really taking out time. We do know that you'd need to leave us at some point, and as such, we would probably just take questions right after your presentation so that we could give a bit more time for you to answer them just before you move on to other pertinent things for the day. But you have the floor now, and you can lead us through in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for inviting us to this high panel. It is really a pleasure to be among such distinguished panelists and with this audience. Thank you so much. I'm going to go straight to the topic of my presentation, which is the role of international humanitarian law in the prevention of internal displacement. Sorry for not having the camera available. I don't know what is happening, but it's just not working. So you will have the pleasure to look at this picture, which was actually from an exhibition that we did at the ICRC on the year of the 2019 team, sorry, on refugees, IDPs, returnees, etc. So international humanitarian law in the prevention of internal displacement. I would like to start with a couple of reminding points on international humanitarian law, or IHL as we like to call it. So IHL is a set of rules that applies in times of armed conflict, and it seeks for humanitarian purposes to protect persons who are not or are no longer directly participating in hostilities. So basically it regulates the means and methods of warfare. IHL does not seek to prevent armed conflict, but rather it establishes minimum standards of human conduct that parties to the conflict must comply with in any situation of armed conflict, be it international or non-international. So how does IHL connect to silencing the guns? Actually, as ICRC, we consider that respect for IHL and other legal frameworks is a very important part of the silencing the guns agenda, because silencing the guns also means restricting the means and methods of warfare to reduce the impact of hostilities on affected populations. Even once war has erupted, decisions that parties to the conflict on the way they conduct war plays a key role in determining the scale of destruction and of suffering that countries and affected populations must recover from. So respect by parties to armed conflict and their obligations under IHL and any other relevant legal framework can actually help people stay in place if they so wish. So if we look at the causes of internal displacement, I mean, why people lived in armed conflicts, we can see different situations. One situation is when parties to the conflict are directly the actors of displacement. So I'm talking about forced displacement. When parties to the conflict take people from one place and bring them to another place, when it is perpetrated by parties to the conflict. It's not the only scenario though. We also see in armed conflict that civilians actually sometimes resort to displacement themselves as a coping mechanism to face the direct or indirect impact of hostilities on their lives. So we see, for instance, that civilians resort to displacement to save their life in the face of direct threats. For instance, when the civilians or their properties are directly targeted by parties to the conflict, or when parties to the conflict use indiscriminate, disproportionate, or indistinct means and methods of warfare. And this includes, for instance, the use of indiscriminate weapons. For instance, anti-personnel landmines that do not discriminate between civilians and combatants. So that definitely is a reason why people might actually flee to directly save their lives. People also flee during armed conflicts due to a more indirect impact of the hostilities on their means of livelihood and on access to basic services. For instance, disruption of markets, degradation of infrastructures that limit access to essential services such as water, healthcare, etc. You see that when it comes to public services infrastructure, even one single attack on a water system or on electricity grid may have immediate effects on the functioning of health facilities, on wastewater management, on public schools, on schools or market, public health, sorry, on schools, on markets, and therefore this will limit people's capacity to meet their needs. So they have to displace themselves in order to seek the fulfillment of such needs. IHL acknowledges that even in situations of conflict, measures must be taken to prevent and limit this, the scale of displacement, be it forced displacement or be it displacement as a coping mechanism. So you find in the Geneva Conventions an express prohibition of forced displacement by parties to the conflict. They may not deport or forcibly transfer civilians, except in two situations. The first situation, if it is for the security of the civilians involved. The second exception is if for imperative military reasons. And even for these two exceptions, the displacement must be temporary. IDPs have the right to voluntarily return in safety to their homes or places of residence as soon as the reasons for their displacement ceases to exist. So even the exceptions are temporary. And it is very clear that deporting or forcibly transferring civilian population outside from these two exceptions can be recognized as a grave breach of international humanitarian law and possibly constitute a war crime. So besides the prohibition of forced displacement by parties to the conflict, you will also find in international humanitarian law, be it the Geneva Conventions or customary international law, other important rules and obligations, which, if they are respected by fighters, can actually help to prevent civilians from having to resort themselves to internal displacement as a coping mechanism. For instance, all the norms that aim at reducing the suffering of civilians, all the norms that aim at preventing the destruction of critical infrastructure, or again, the norms that aim at preserving the integrity of essential systems and people's means of survival. You'll find in the Geneva Conventions, for instance, the prohibition of direct attack on civilians, the principle of distinction between civilian and military objects, of the prohibition of sexual violence, which is very important because, as you know, sexual violence is one of the main causes for which entire communities will displace themselves in prevention for fear of being exposed to the issue. So international humanitarian law does contain important provisions that can contribute to preventing and limiting the scale of internal displacement. However, these norms remain useless if they are not implemented. States have a responsibility to implement IHL. And it is very important, I think, to highlight that this responsibility should be applied both in wartime, but also in peacetime. It's not only when war has started that you must think about what's the legal framework that you should have. You should prepare, you should be ready already. You should be ready in times of peace. Establish translate the relevant IHL norms into your domestic laws and policies. Establish the relevant implementing structures, etc. Also, it is very important, I think, that states should ensure that those at the forefront in times of armed conflict, be it armed forces, be it police, be it security agents, are adequately trained to respect IHL norms when conflict starts. I will have some concluding points and then leave the floor open for questions. But just, yes, a couple of points. Just to restate again that without greater respect for IHL and more efforts to protect the civilian population during armed conflict, internal displacement cannot be effectively prevented. So it is important to establish a solid dialogue with all parties to a conflict to improve compliance with IHL and with all other relevant legal frameworks such as human rights law or else. This dialogue should emphasize the harm that is caused by displacement, and it could, for instance, build on local norms and rules that may induce more restraints among parties to conflict on how they conduct war, the means and methods that they use during war. The ICRC constantly calls on states to strengthen their commitment and capacity to respect and ensure respect for IHL and other legal frameworks that protect civilians from the effects of armed conflict and violence. Through our advisory service on IHL, we actually provide states, upon their request, with assistance and advice on their obligations to implement IHL at the national level. And also, we do support states for the training and strengthening of capacities of the armed forces, police, and security agents. This support actually is provided with the ultimate aim of creating a conducive environment for compliance with the basic rules of IHL and other relevant legal frameworks as they apply to armed conflict and law enforcement. So once again, ensuring respect for IHL means contributing to effective prevention of internal displacement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Angelique, for such a brilliant presentation, and thank you for emphasizing the pertinent role of international humanitarian law in the prevention of internal displacement. We do know that you'll be leaving us very shortly, as you need to travel back from the northern region of Ethiopia. So I would just kindly like to ask if there are any specific questions for Ms. Angelique just before she leaves us. If you have specific questions, kindly just indicate by either raising up your hand or put in your questions in the chat box, and we'll be sure to have Ms. Angelique answer your questions.
Thank you very much. I am around for 20 minutes, so I'm still around for questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And maybe just a question probably to Ms. Angelique. You had mentioned the centrality of IHL, and indeed this is extremely important, also reflecting on the regional landscape of the continent and the centrality of issues of conflict in relation to internal displacement. But I just wanted to ask you, perhaps from your reflection, how could we, when we think about national context on the continent and the extent of the implementation of IHL vis-a-vis the protection of forcibly displaced populations, how can we strengthen institutions? And I speak of institutions in the context of national institutions, and perhaps if you could also reflect on which specific institution you would probably say is very important, particularly within the context of fostering IHL respect and really ensuring IHL compliance in order to also build up momentum in the furtherance of conflict prevention on the continent. And as you just answered that question, there was another question that just came up around, is it possible for countries to claim protection of IDPs without institutional and legal framework? So I think it sort of links back also to the pertinence of institutions and law within the context of IHL. If you could perhaps just reflect on those questions very briefly, that would be great. And if there are other further questions just before you leave, we'll be sure to also indicate that. Thank you, Ms. Angelique.
Thank you very much. Regarding the first question, what we see is that we work mainly with, obviously, the Parliament, which is a key institution for integration of IHL into national laws. So we work a lot with the Parliament. We work also with any institution that has to do with the conduct of war and law enforcement operations. Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Interiors, etc. We do work with them, and they play a key role indeed in the implementation of international humanitarian law, either within laws or policies of guidelines, standards, SOPs, etc. Code of conducts. These play a key role. And maybe also one point is that what we see is that it is very relevant to establish IHL commission at national level to help to coordinate actually between all the institutions that need actually to be involved in the implementation of international humanitarian law. You can do it without an IHL commission, but what we see from the example of countries that we support, when there is an IHL commission that exists, that has a global perspective and the right level of networking that it needs to have with the relevant institution, that the process of implementation is really, really more effective and more conducive. About, let me see, I have very, very bad short-term memory. So I often need to look again at questions. Let me see again. What was the second
so
question?
I think there was a question around the pertinence of institutional and legal frameworks, but there was also the question, I think, just probably linked back to that other question is our institutions working in light with, I think this was a question from Prof. Derishi around how institutions work in line with sovereignty as a responsibility principle. But I guess one question that may be imperative to answer in this context would be, at what point does human rights violations become a violation of international humanitarian law? So this is a pertinent question from one of our distinguished participants, and who is accountable, especially when a sovereign nation is reluctant to bring the perpetrators to book. So I think he's also speaking not just in terms of state actors, but then also non-state actors. Yes. If you could probably.
Yes, sorry, my connection is a little bit bad. I'm not sure that I got everything what to say, but I'm reading the question also in the chat. So I will try to answer, and if I'm missing the point, please correct me. There is not really, let's say, a degree in terms of like human rights violation becoming a violation of international humanitarian law. There are two parallel bodies of law that may apply at the same time or not. International humanitarian law applies in times of armed conflict. Human rights law applies in any time. So there are common violations between the two. For instance, sexual violence, let's say, which is an easy one. Let's say applies. You have sexual violence as a violation in human rights. You have sexual violence as a violation in international humanitarian law. It's more the scope of application that is different as international humanitarian law applies in times of conflict. In terms of being held accountable, definitely then that brings us to criminal law. It may bring us to international criminal tribunals, but I guess it is important to remember that states have the primary responsibility for holding accountable those who are perpetrators of violations, be it of international humanitarian law, of human rights, I guess as well. But it's beside this state responsibility, you will also find indeed a secondary responsibility from international special tribunals, etc., that also exist, and that have different ways of being seized, of being competent on a case or not. So I guess that would be the complement to states' primary responsibility for holding accountable those responsible. If a state cannot or will not hold accountable, indeed, then there is a secondary responsibility of external tribunals. Why do you think our country is hesitant to adopt the guiding principles on internal displacement? I don't know if it is a question addressed to me specifically or to all participants. It's a large question. It's a very, very large question. I guess some do not have the capacity. Some others have different priorities, possibly. And the reasons, the perception of displacement is very variable. It depends, right, based on situations. There are some situations where the state is very willing to support, indeed, to prevent, protect, or assist internally displaced people. There are other situations where the state itself actually is responsible for the displacement, as I was saying in the case of forced displacement. There are other situations where I don't know, maybe there is, as I was saying, there are other priorities. So scenarios may be different. And it's, I guess it has to be looked at on a case by case basis.
Thank you very much for that excellent point. And I think you made something very concrete, a recommendation that we need to look at each situations on a case by case basis. So in terms of even why countries hesitate in developing norms, it's imperative to have a case by case analysis of such situations. Thank you so much for that excellent point and for really reflecting and bringing us to that pertinent place of understanding what needs to be done in the furtherance of preventing conflicts, particularly from the position that you've emphasized very strongly, which is the place of IHL and the centrality of it in the furtherance of addressing issues of internal displacement. Thank you so much for this. And I would just say that perhaps if you have any questions still left unanswered, please kindly just indicate it in the chat box. And while Ms. Angelique is still with us, she will be sure to respond to your questions. over the chat box just before she leaves. But thank you so much, Ms. Angelique, for really taking out time, and we do a very safe travel.
My pleasure, really.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And next, we'd like to move on to our next presenter, Dr. Walters Sama, who is the Head of Mission Analysis Cell at the African Union Mission in Somalia. Dr. Walters, as we had said, has extensive experience and knowledge in this field, having significantly developed pertinent strategies for preventing conflict in Africa, and of course, also having a significant context, regional context, which is very important. And those of us, of course, who have worked on issues of conflict, we know how central the context of Somalia is, especially in understanding issues that resonate continentally, but more importantly as well, we see how pertinent it is in seeing what strategies the African Union is also taken in the furtherance of addressing the issues of conflict prevention. And Dr. Walter Sama will be speaking on implementing the AU's Silencing the Guns agenda in Somalia and its impacts on internally displaced persons. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Walters to lead us through his pertinent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Walters. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Romola. It's really an honor to be sharing this platform with such distinguished panelists and great participants, just based on the comments and input they are providing on the chat section. I'm sure you can see it now. Thanks. So here I will be sharing, I will use just 10 to 15 minutes to share a concrete example of the African Union implementing its silencing the gun agenda in practice with the case of Somalia. As you know, when you talk of Somalia over the past 3 decades, people think of state collapse, forced displacement, warlord, Islamism, piracy, interclan conflict. You hear of all sorts of issues that trigger forced displacement, and insecurity is one of them. And that started since the collapse of the central government in 1991. Efforts were made by many international partners, including the UN, to restore the Somali state, and that was very difficult. The African Union decided in 2007 to deploy a peacekeeping, or I might say a peace enforcement operation in Somalia. And what this says is the African Union started implementing efforts to silence the gun even before the slogan "Silence the Gun" was developed some seven years ago. And you could see that their coming into the scene really changed the dynamics in Somalia. Oftentimes I say the deployment of the African Union mission in Somalia, called AMISOM, was a game changer for Somalia, especially considering previous efforts that have been undertaken by the US, by the UN, all of which have failed. And so the primary objective of the African Union at the time was indeed to silence the gun, using military means, enforcing or compelling peace in a country that had been ravaged by armed conflict, interclan war, and civil war. And in essence, since the deployment of the African Union mission in Somalia in 2007, that's over 12 years ago, that example has been used as proof of the African Union, implementing its mantra of African solutions to African problems, providing African solutions to African problems. And I could just list some of the progress Somalia has made over the past 12 years. Over 80% of the country that was controlled by Islamist and terrorist groups have been recovered. And major cities like the capital city, Mogadishu, major cities like Kismayo, Baidoa, have been recovered from the terrorist groups, and governments have taken over from there. You have a functional administration led by the federal government and by regional governments operating and providing services to a people that had gone for more than 2 decades without a government. You also have a situation where international aid organizations that were operating previously in Nairobi, they have been able to relocate to Mogadishu, and they are operating in Mogadishu and in other major cities and towns across Somalia, delivering humanitarian assistance, delivering peace and stabilization activities have been going on, largely thanks to the deployment and the security and enabling environment that the African Union forces are providing in Somalia. Of course, you see examples where people who are running away from remote areas controlled by Al-Shabaab and coming to major cities and locations where you have government or AMISOM troops just for their protection. But I'm also seeing the refugees across the world, especially in Kenya, who are able to come to Somalia. So you could see that because of statelessness and because of armed conflict, Somalis are scattered all over the world as refugees, but also within Somalia, there are even greater numbers. UNHCR will talk of more than 2.6 million Somalis who are internally displaced. That's such a huge number, and it tells you that Somalia is one of the countries hosting the largest number of internally displaced persons. And it presents a situation where you have a complex, it presents a very complex situation of protracted displacement of people who were born as IDPs and they have lived all their lives as IDPs to becoming adults. And you could imagine that the great challenge there, what do you do with such a situation? In spite of the efforts that the African Union has made by deploying peacekeepers to impose peace in Somalia, in spite of the progress that has been made, this more than 2 million displaced persons are still finding it very challenging, because most of them, I think more than 80%, more than 75% of Somali IDPs are living in urban or semi-urban areas, and where there is just, they can enjoy their rights and freedoms. And many of them, if not 80% of the IDPs, are living in kind of makeshift or informal camps and sites, and often not receiving adequate humanitarian assistance. Worse still, because of the improving security situation in Somalia and in those major cities, landlords that had fled out of the country or to other areas are coming back to reclaim their land. And they are doing so in a way that violates the rights of these IDPs who are currently occupying. And so we've seen situations of forced eviction of IDPs in Somalia. And there are an estimated 2,000 sites of IDPs across Somalia, many of whom do not receive adequate protection, assistance from the government and from international organizations. So in spite of the efforts that the African Union has made, using what I may call the hard approach of deploying peacekeepers to impose peace, which has really helped to provide security and enable the government to undertake measures to protect and provide assistance to IDPs, the challenges that remain are still huge. And because of the protracted displacement, many of these millions of IDPs would like to return to their original settlements. But the situation on the ground, the situation there is just not conducive for them to go back. Mostly because of they have lost their livelihood. So it becomes less of a problem of security, but more of a problem of livelihood, governance, service delivery. And that's why all the previous speakers have talked about the relevance of governance in enabling IDPs, providing a durable solution to IDPs. So the IDPs are now trapped in the urban centers. They want to go back to their original locations. They can't do so, partly because of insecurity, prevailing insecurity, but more because of the absence of means of livelihood if they have to go back. Again, because our forces, or the AMISOM forces, are undertaking offensive operations against terrorist groups, many of which have, escaped to remote areas. For their survival, they are engaging in an aggressive recruitment of young people to increase their ranks and to be able to continue their operations. This too is triggering new displacements of people leaving those remote areas. And so you have those protracted displaced persons, and then you have new ones that are generated by the aggressive campaign by Al-Shabaab to recruit young people to join their ranks. And this is creating a very difficult situation. So the emphasis here is to finding a durable solution to these IDPs, perhaps through local integration in the areas they have lived almost all their lives, or providing governance as service delivery and other means of developing their skills so that they can consider the possibility of voluntarily going back to their original settlements. In spite of this challenge, we've seen progress over the past few years. I think just last year, the Somali government, enacted a new policy on displacement that also provides a guidelines on, how people could be evicted from their land. And much of the implementation would have taken place this year, but unfortunately, because of COVID, most of those priorities have been shifted, have been pushed to the background, and focus now is trying to deal with the COVID situation. So in summary, we find this is an example of the African Union implementing its silencing the gun agenda. The concept, if it was crafted recently, but the practice started a long time ago with the example of the deployment of the peacekeeping troops in Somalia in March 2017, which imposed peace in Somalia and have been fighting the terrorist group and trying to end the violent conflict in Somalia. And that has really enabled IDPs to enjoy their rights, and more importantly, to create a conducive environment for the government to do its job, and that of protecting IDPs and giving them assistance, which is, of course, their primary responsibility. Yet challenges remain, and those challenges are way beyond what the military can do. It really has to do with governance, service delivery, and that is something for the government to do with the support of international community. I would like to stop here, as I promised, take 10-15 minutes just to give you this personal perspective on what is taking place in Somalia in terms of the African Union in practice, putting in its silencing the gun agenda in practice. I'm sure there may be a few questions. I will come back to you to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walter Sama, for such brilliant presentation, and really reflecting also on the Somali context. And I do know that there are going to be a plethora of questions in this regard in order to stimulate the discussion and really provide a context for the purpose of our discussion today. Thank you for that analysis once more. And now we'll move on to Dr. Japhet Bigon, who will be speaking to us about justice and accountability as critical elements in silencing the guns. And I must say that Dr. Japhet Bigon comes with significant expertise over the last couple of decades, I'd say, in relation to human rights protection, but more importantly as well, understanding the critical dimensions of human rights issues in Africa, on conflict prevention, on governance, but more importantly as well, on how to advance a continental agenda. And it's such a pleasure to have Dr. Japhet Bigon be part of us. Dr. Japhet Bigon, as I earlier said, is the Regional Advocacy Coordinator for Africa and Amnesty International, and amongst many other things, he's an excellent author as well, and an erudite scholar. Dr. Japhet Bigon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Romola, and it really gives me great pleasure to be part of this exciting panel and discussion today. Really, the speakers that have gone before me have eloquently spoken to the key issues that relate to displacement and the silencing the guns campaign of the African Union. As you've rightly indicated, really my focus is on justice and accountability, which really dovetails into the broader question of governance that previous speakers have spoken to, because justice and accountability is a key pillar, a key element of any democratic, stable and effective governance system. And just to begin, speakers before me have really, gone around the continent to mention the many violent conflicts that bedevil the continent and the scourge of conflict that has been with us for many decades now. And there is, these conflicts, they differ in the triggers that cause them, in the scale of those conflicts, from small conflicts to large conflicts, but also in the impact of the conflict. But there are two common denominators, a thread that connects all of them that I want to propose here today. One is that in almost all conflicts, actually almost without exception, we found that violent conflicts on the African continent, serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law that our colleague from the ICRC spoke about. Serious violations of human rights, some of which rise to the levels of crimes against humanity and war crimes. We've witnessed this in South Sudan, in Sudan, in Mali, in Central African Republic, in Libya, and in many other violent conflicts across the continent. The prevalence of human rights violations committed not just by armed groups, but also by state security forces is something that connects all the conflicts across the continent. The second common denominator of violent conflicts on the continent, and that is really the primary focus of my discussion, is that in almost all these conflicts, again, almost without exception, there is prevalent impunity for perpetrators of these serious violations of human rights, serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Such that whereas 2020, we had hoped that guns will be silent, instead we have seen that guns have been louder throughout the year. But even more importantly, if there is anything that has been silenced over the years and even this year, is the calls for accountability and justice for victims of those human rights violations that have occurred in the context of conflicts. We've even seen attempts to silence individuals, organizations that call for accountability for and justice in the context of conflict. Right from South Sudan to northeastern Nigeria, we see organizations that try to call for accountability and justice in this context being vilified, stigmatized, and tried to be silenced. So in the end, what we get as the year draws to an end is silencing of justice and accountability, and silencing of actors that try to call for justice and accountability. And my central element, therefore, is really to build on to what Professor Khadiagala said, that actually one of the reasons of the failure to silence the guns, as had been anticipated by the end of this year, has been the lack of justice and accountability in terms of interventions to these conflicts. And this can be seen across the continent. In many countries where there is conflict, we have seen state actors and relevant actors that would try to negotiate and bring peace, always sidelining and putting questions of justice and accountability on the back burner if they do not actually actively try to stall and block justice. Just to give an example, in South Sudan, where both parties to the conflict that started in 2013 having not less than 2 agreements, so one signed in 2015 and another one signed in 2018, have agreed amongst themselves that justice and accountability is a critical element in restoring peace and bringing the country back to stability. But what we have seen is that despite putting their signature to this document, they turn back and deliberately stall and block the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan. And we have seen, for instance, the state going to great lengths to block the establishment of this court by, for instance, hiring an American-based consultancy with a consultancy fee of about $2 million US simply to block the creation of this court. Did call for the establishment of a proper mechanism to bring perpetrators to justice. Up to date, 5 years later, there has been no progress on that front. And in all these conflicts on the continent, the lack of accountability fuels renewed violence, fuels the cycle of violence. And it's for this reason that in many countries, they have remained in a protracted state of conflict because perpetrators who violate human rights, but also even ceasefire agreements, know for sure they can go to sleep knowing that their actions will not be met with any sanctions, with any punishment, or any form of consequence. But perhaps I'm painting a very grim picture. There has been some attempts in several countries bedeviled by conflict to ensure that there is some form of accountability and justice. So for instance, we know in Central African Republic, there has been the establishment with the support of the United Nations of the Special Criminal Court, and a few perpetrators of serious human rights violations in the context of that conflict in Central African Republic have been brought before the Special Criminal Court. In South Sudan, there's been at least one case, the Terrain case, that involved government security forces that attacked the Terrain Hotel in July of 2016 and raped and killed a journalist, were brought before a military tribunal and charged for offenses and convicted. We have seen in northeastern Nigeria, for instance, the government bringing several perpetrators affiliated to Boko Haram to trial. But there are always 3 things that have accompanied most of these trials that we have seen in the context of the conflicts in these specific countries. One is that in more often than not, the attempts to bring and foster justice and accountability is one-sided, like we have seen in northern eastern Nigeria, for instance. Armed forces, the violations that have been committed by armed forces have never been investigated, nor serious accountability mechanisms put in place to ensure that there is justice for those violations committed on the side of the state. In South Sudan, although this was an important case, we know that it's because of the serious international pressure, because of the involvement of foreign victims in that case. But even so, both in Nigeria and in South Sudan, there were serious questions about fair trial in relation to those cases. So we see attempts at accountability and justice, but really not only one-sided, but questions of fair trial arising. And a third issue is always that in almost all conflicts, it is really the junior officers or the foot soldiers that are brought to that there is attempt to bring them to justice. This is evident, for instance, in DRC, in South Sudan, in other countries. The people who organize, the people who fund, finance, the people who are in command of violations and abuses that occur are rarely brought to book. So it's almost always these foot soldiers that are served as sacrificial lambs in an attempt to show the world that there is justice and accountability being pursued. But also, there's been discussion before about the role of the African Union generally in this project. But in the context of justice and accountability, we've seen that the actions of the African Union have rarely risen above the rhetoric. So we know that the Constitutive Act of the African Union provides, for instance, of a condemnation of impunity and justice and human rights as core principles and objectives of the institution. But in many instances, we have seen that the African Union has not taken concrete, tangible steps to ensure that across the continent, violations in the context of conflict are punished and justice is served to the perpetrators. And just to give an example, really, is in the case of South Sudan, where the African Union has a clear role both in the 2015 peace agreement and in the 2018 peace agreement to work with the South Sudan government to establish a hybrid court of South Sudan. We've seen many communiques of the Peace and Security Council, many statements from the office of the chairperson concerning the establishment of this court. But really, there is the steps that have been taken so far, more than 5 since 2015 with the signing of the first agreement, has not seen us coming closer to the establishment of the court. The process has been stalled by the South Sudan government, and it seems that the African Union has all along been entertaining the South Sudan government and accommodating it. And as a result, for many victims of human rights violations in South Sudan, whereas they had thought that the establishment of this court will be their last hope, that hope is still deferred. Their dream of ever finding justice is still deferred. But also in the context of silencing the guns program or a flagship program of the African Union, we know that in 2016, the African Union adopted the Addis Ababa Roadmap. And it's one of the very elaborate documents that sets out the root causes of conflicts on the continent, but also sets out 20 very clear, tangible interventions that the African Union member states and other actors need to do to ensure that we would have silenced the guns by 31st of this month. But one notable missing element in the roadmap was the question of justice and accountability. It's not well articulated or given prominence in the Addis Ababa roadmap. And I think whether the deadline is 2030 or 2063, as Professor Khadiagala has suggested, justice and accountability must be part of the roadmap towards ensuring that conflicts and the consequential forced displacement of individuals and populations is dealt with. Then finally, I think whenever we speak about justice and accountability, two things arise, and I want to make that clarification. First, of course, when we speak about justice, we speak about a broader concept. So I have focused predominantly on criminal justice, but justice is really a broader concept that also encompasses, for instance, reparative and restorative justice. But even in this sense of reparative and restorative justice, we see very little being done in conflict settings to provide reparations to victims of human rights violations, to victims of displacement, even in the context of Kenya that my colleague Abebe did mention, is that they're still up to date internally displaced people from 2007, 2008 conflict that still have not received forms of reparations that the government had rolled out. So in many conflicts, even when we do not speak about criminal justice, even reparative and restorative justice is not provided. This, as part of the broader argument, contributes to fueling of violence, because in many cases, one of the root causes and the trigger for violence and conflict is that individuals feel that their human rights, feel that the justice that they so deserve has not been provided, and therefore they seek other means of making that point. Then the final point to make in the context of justice discussion is that always there is this old debate about justice versus peace. Always the argument is that peace should be pursued first and then justice perhaps later. But I think this debate about peace versus justice is always draws a false distinction, that peace and justice are two different things and cannot be pursued simultaneously. Yet we know, for instance, in the AU transitional justice policy, this issue has been addressed by, for instance, suggesting of balancing and sequencing of the both imperatives of peace versus justice. And just to give in the context of South Sudan how this could work, is that while peace is being sought through the peace agreements and bringing stability to the country, it may be important, for instance, to create just the investigation part of the hybrid court for South Sudan, so that it may begin to collect evidence and conduct investigation. Otherwise, if the question of justice is thrown way or too far into the future, by that time evidence will be lost, memories will have faded, and it will then be even almost impossible to pursue justice. So even the AU itself, transitional justice policy, recognizes that it is possible to sequence and balance justice and peace and be able to obtain the benefits and the value that both of them bring into restoring societies back into stability, prosperity, and democratic governance. Romola, I'll stop there and hope that we'll have more during the question and answers session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Japheth Bigon. Such an excellent summation of points. And it's very interesting that you actually allude also to the old debate about justice versus peace, and the fact that, this is really a false distinction because both can be simultaneously pursued. And the African Indian Transitional Justice Framework, of course, reinforcing these patterns. Thank you for that excellent summation of points and really giving such scholarly presentation on this point. And on this note, I would really like to once more thank all our panelists for such brilliant presentations, and also our keynote presenter for really walking us through the narratives upon which the analysis in this webinar has also been built. And I do see that there are a plethora of questions, and at this point we'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you do have specific questions that you'd like to ask, please kindly raise your hands so that we will call upon you. I do see that there are some questions that have been asked in the chat box, and many thanks also to Dr. Alinhoni for really engaging our distinguished participants as well in the chat box. I'll just probably start off with the questions, but please, if you do have questions, raise up your hand. We'd really like to call on you to present your questions and to state your thoughts and analysis following from the pertinent points made by our presenters. So there's a question here around, and please do also put your name so that we can call on you specifically. But at this point, I would call on, I do see that a person by the name, I think Galaxy 82 Core has a question. You had raised up your hand. Would you like to ask your question by kindly unmuting your mic? Please, when you ask your questions, kindly state your name and also let us know to whom you direct your questions, if it's to specifically Professor Khadiagala, or if you'd like to ask Dr. Alinhoni or Dr. Japheth Bigon or Dr. Walter Sama. Thank you very much. If you have one, please kindly also put on your video so we can see. Thank you.
I would like to ask the last speaker. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm Reverend Matthias, originally from Burundi. currently residing in South Africa. And my question was, in a country like where they've been war or conflict for a long time, when should the accountability and the justice start? It would start from which period to which period? I'm talking like Burundi war have been there and the conflict since the 60s till now. Some may argue that the situation is still not okay. So when do you start, or who do you hold accountable from such a long period? I want to ask that from the exactly the one who just spoke now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Matthias. And I think your question goes to Dr. Japheth Bigon, and that's duly noted by him. And I do see that there's a question also for Dr. Abebe, who has also been gracefully answering the questions in the chat box. And the question is by Mr. Chan, that while ratification of the Kampala Convention is an important step towards protection of IDP rights, there is usually a sizable gap between what states commit to on paper and what they actually do on the ground. Is this true for the Kampala Convention, or are states doing well? And he also asked, what is your general evaluation of the commitment of African states towards monitoring compliance via Article 14 of the Kampala Convention, which speaks to monitoring compliance and the role of the Conference of State Parties, the African Commission, the African Peer Review Mechanism, but then also relevant institutions as well within this context, and states working collaboratively with them. There's also a question to Dr. Bigon, which is what can be done to make sure there is justice and accountability in Burundi? Who is supposed to implement justice and accountability in Burundi? So I think this is a question for you in light of your pertinent points raised. And I think there's also a question that how can the AU and its protection systems help and protect such human rights defenders, I think, in situations, leveraging on what is going on continentally, but then also within the Burundi context. But if you would also like to ask this question, because I do see that this question is from, I think it's from Burundi, and I'm not sure if this is a question from, I think it's from the Burundian Human Rights Organization. So if you would like to ask your question specifically, that would be most welcome. And I do see that there's also a pertinent question as well that has been asked, and that was asked to our panelists, not least, of course, in light of what we see on the continent in the furtherance of protection of possibly displaced populations. And there was a question, I think, that goes across board to all our panelists around what we think countries, why do we think countries are hesitant perhaps to adopt norms relating to internal displacement. Please do feel free to ask your questions, and it would be great to probably have you raise up your hand and ask specifically this question so that we do not miss out on any of the questions in the chat box, even as we also favor you using that platform as well. I do see that your hand, Mr. Richard Obedi, and I would like to call on you. Please kindly unmute your mic and ask your question. I also do see you, Mr. Sintem Bile Lunguza. So I think you'd probably speak just right after Mr. Richard Obedi. Please do kindly also show your video so that we can see you. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear
Hello.
you.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Romola, for organizing this event. Yes, the presentations were so in depth. My question goes to Dr. Jaffa. Thank you, Doctor. It's been a long time. I think the last time we met was during the Citizen Continental Conference in Addis. Now, you talked of justice and peace. In the case of Uganda, that path, actually justice kind of snubbed the people of Northern Uganda up to now. And you must have also been aware of what is going on in the ICC in The Hague, because it reached a point whereby the war took long, and then at the time of the government, for instance, or maybe other relevant bodies to institute institute a mechanism where the people who have suffered the brunt of the war should actually get justice. Up to now, it's 20 years down the road. So that path you've proposed, and especially for the case of South Sudan, maybe you can use Uganda as a learning point so that the people of South Sudan should get justice. Because the moment we take it up with laxity, like the way the Ugandan case is done, I know people will suffer and they will never get this justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. And I think, so I think we have Mr. Sitem Bele Unguza. You can unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Madam. And thank you very much for the informative presentations. Indeed, they are enriching one's understanding. Help us out here. Currently, we do not have one policy that talks to one Africa. So that on its own is challenging. And as a result, people who are experiencing problems in their respective countries, they are in one way or another forced to leave or to flee so that they can find better opportunities or livelihood in other countries. I'm from South Africa, and then the challenges that we have is that our fellow Africans, they come down to South Africa. Now, the challenges that we find is that we're not appreciating about the manner with which the colleagues do we then avoid. My feeling is that the issue of dealt with by our states, and as a result, it also causes problems between us. What kind of mechanisms can be put in place to ensure that we avoid?
Many thanks, Mr. Sitembele, for that pertinent. I think there was just a concern while you were asking the question. We couldn't hear you properly. I guess it was just an issue with your network. If you don't mind, if perhaps the network is better, do you want to repeat your question? And maybe just very shortly so that we can get that and our panelists can answer your question. Or perhaps if you would like to also indicate it in the chat box, but maybe if you could just kindly repeat the question, just perhaps in 30 seconds so that it's clear. Thank you. I think we probably just lost you, but please do kindly put your question in the chat box so that we can get the question and perhaps it will be answered by one of our panelists. Thank you so much for that. And now we'd move on to a question. I do see that Mr. Peter, you have a question around how we could probably enhance justice or peace, and you're also now speaking to issues around land grabs and forced evictions much more specifically, but of course the fact that this links back to issues of internal displacement as well, and there's a need to have these issues addressed. And there was also a question that was asked, I think, by one of our distinguished guests, I think Miss Nicoline. If I'm not mistaken, you said considering the different types of conflicts occurring in Africa, including intertribal and farmer others conflicts, I suppose that's what you're referring to, which also leads to displacement. How is the Kampala Convention localized to entertain such context-specific situations? I do see that we do have a plethora of questions, and I would just like to have our panelists respond to these questions one after the other. And please, if you do have further questions, kindly put them in the chat box. And if there's certain questions you've asked that perhaps has not been read out, please also indicate in the chat box and be sure to ask these questions. So please, I'd like to call upon Dr. Haleoni, and then we'll move on to Dr. Walter Sama, and then would move on to Dr. Japheth Bigon in answering the questions. Many thanks. Sorry, Dr. Haleoni, I think your mic is muted.
Thank you, moderator, facilitator, for this opportunity again, and also our colleagues who have asked. It was a very engaged, the chat room issue, how we see the gaps in terms of implementation of the Kampala Convention. Like any other international instrument, the implementation is big. There are progress, that's what we are saying. For instance, after ratifying the Kampala Convention, significant crisis due to Boko Haram attacks, climate change, mixed migration movement has gone ahead and implemented the convention through a national legislation, and that's positive. And other countries less so in terms of national legislations after they ratify. As I said, around 31 countries have ratified. And a specific question when it comes to monitoring and accountability, we see increasing reporting, especially to the African Commission on Human People's Rights and the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and the Welfare of Children. In the national report, states are increasingly making reference to displacement in the human rights context. That's positive. We have also had one initial conference of parties meeting back in 2017 in Harare, and there is a Harare action plan. We were hoping last year to have the second state party meeting, but it didn't take place. So we are hoping next year we will be reviewing with the African Union and partners the implementation of the Harare action plan. And so if you ask me between 0 and 10, 10 being the best, I would say using the monitoring around 6, or 5.5. So that means there is a significant space to grow. Another colleague has asked in terms of trends in implementing the norms, accepting the norms. Actually, there is a significant recognition of the guiding principles, both the Great Lakes Protocol, signed by like more than 10 member states, around 11 member states of the Great Lakes region, and the Kampala Convention, which is, again, clearly recognize the guiding principles. So actually, last year in 2018, we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the United Nations first guiding principles on IDPs. And together with other partners, we are rolling out different initiatives to promote the guiding principles. And it's so encouraging to see in places like South Sudan, in Nigeria, in Niger, in DRC, how member states are increasingly recognizing the guiding principles. Another question that was flagged was the role of the Kampala Convention when it comes to farmer pastoralist conflicts. This is especially in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, it's quite common. There is a reference to that pastoralist communities, especially in the Kampala Convention. The issue of, it's very comprehensive and broad. Issues like development-related displacement, pastoralist displacement around resource management. And so the Kampala Convention is not actually about conflict. It's the theme of this meeting is about conflict. That's why we focused on, even for this theme, the resource dimension of conflict it's very visible. So the Kampala Convention is quite comprehensive. And then maybe if you allow, facilitator, is it okay just to highlight a couple of questions as well? Okay, thank you very much. And one colleague also asked very important questions around disabilities and the right of disabled IDPs. And in fact, it was in my PowerPoint, but I didn't have a chance to mention it. When we respond as governments and also international humanitarian community, we need to really acknowledge that IDPs come in different shapes, colors, and forms. We have women, we have children, we have disabled people, people living with disability, we have people with different health conditions, and then we have people with different kind of issues and needs. And so the specificity based on our gender and disability and age lens, we need to be very attentive to those needs. And this is also, again, reflected on the Kampala Convention. The others, on refugees, there were a couple of questions, and I think I addressed it in the chat. Another important point, colleague, displaced people, how vulnerable they are and how invisible. And this is quite true. In many countries, in mega cities and big cities, invisible. great cities are great. They create opportunities. You can really survive and engage in different kind of livelihood options, but also they bring risks, and this sexual abuse and exploitations, harassment with the police, and just being invisible to local, urban authorities and municipalities. And that's why increasingly we, be it as UNHCR and or the African Union or others, are increasingly trying to highlight this need. And there is a need to identify these people through data and better. And sometimes it's not necessarily the United Nations system which is better placed. You have NGOs very active in the urban setting. Sometimes it's local municipal authorities. So it's the need and say we are working on that. That we can work with. Let me pause for now, and I keep on interacting. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Dr. Alunoni, for such brilliant response. Thank you for that. Now I'd like to move on to Dr. Walter Sama.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Romola. I'm not too sure there was a specific question addressed to me, but just to speak generally on some of the issues that were raised in those questions. And the issue of accountability was, there was so many questions revolving around the issue of accountability. If we go by what the keynote address that was delivered, the important with what the professor talked about, a lot of countries, we see a lot of democratic backsliding across Africa, and this is undermining the EU's silencing the gun agenda, because in most countries where the ruling the ruling elite has decided to either maneuver or manipulate the constitution to extend their stay, it's really created a divisive situation. And whether it's Cote d'Ivoire or it's Guinea, I think that's what is more important is seeing how the people themselves, what I could consider the people agency, can be used to ensure accountability, perhaps with the support of the international community. Because trying to use multilateral organizations like the UN or the African Union, they have a lot of shortcomings as a result of the so-called principle of the sovereignty of states. But empowering the people themselves to hold their government and their state institutions accountable when they undertake measures that are not in line with rule of law or democratic practices, thereby compromising on the security situation and triggering more displacement. It's something that should be encouraged. And we've seen examples, whether it's in Ghana or in Kenya, where you have a very vibrant civil society, very vibrant media. They also help in, kind of the public or the people holding governments accountable, even just by, and then another element is, education of the IDPs. A lot of IDPs don't know their rights, and because they don't know their rights, they can't even put pressure on the institutions to, provide the services and the protection that they needed. So in countries where you have NGOs or, scholars working on IDP situation, I think one of the important things to do is find ways of educating the masses and educating, the IDPs themselves on how they can claim their rights that are provided by the Constitution, the law, and by also the international law. Those are the few comments I could make based on what I got from the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walters. Apologies, I think my internet just blocked me off at that point. I'd just like now to move on to Dr. Japhet Bigon. You have the floor.
Thank you, Romola. I'd like to start with a question posed by Reverend Mathias on when or how far back should, for instance, Burundi go in terms of pursuing justice. This is usually a complex question in transitional justice contexts. And it's usually a question that arises, particularly in the context of the establishment of truth commissions. And the simple answer to it is that, and actually the African Union Transitional Justice Policy refers to this, is that these pursuits should be context specific. So it should be on a case by case basis, depending on the history, the context of the country, and the major events of violations in the history of a country. So you will see, for instance, in South Africa, it covered a 34-year period in terms of going back, looking into the past. In Kenya, it was from 1963 to 2008, almost a 48 period. The Gambia, that is currently looking back into it, looking into its past, is covering a 22-year period from 1994 to 2017. So it is really context specific. I cannot tell when, how far back Burundi should go. It will depend on the context, the history, the violations, and all that. But it's usually a very contested questions in many contexts where there is a pursuit for justice and accountability. It has been raised even in South Sudan. It has been raised in Ethiopia, for instance, with the, since 2018 with the establishment of a reconciliation commission in that country. Then there's been a question on what can be done to pursue justice in Burundi. As I said, and I think Walters also has mentioned this, the 2015 human rights violations were documented by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and that report submitted to the Peace and Security Council. So what has been lacking in the context of Burundi has been really pressure from different stakeholders to ensure that the country or other actors really pursue justice and accountability in that country. And just going back to Professor Khadiagala's speech, he did focus on sub-regional bodies, and we have seen that where there's been some little progress, generally in terms of dealing with human rights issues, dealing with displacement and accountability and justice issue, we have seen it's where there is strong sub-regional communities or organizations. So for instance, ECOWAS has fared pretty well in terms of dealing with conflicts in the Western African region, compared, for instance, in the East African region, where the East African community has not performed very well, and has, for instance, in the context of Burundi, really played a very passive role in that context. So I think also the cohesiveness of a region and the commitment of that sub-region to values of human rights, accountability, justice, plays a critical role in ensuring that justice is pursued. There was a comment, I think, not necessarily a question on Uganda and how lessons can be drawn for South Sudan. I completely agree with that comment. The longer it takes for justice to be pursued, the more likely then that the prospects diminish significantly. As they say, in many other issues of life, I think you have to hit the iron when it's still hot and red. And that is, for instance, what many actors have been calling for in respect of South Sudan. Thank you, Romola.
Thank you very much for that pertinent analysis and the excellent point you raised in response to the questions. I just perhaps we just open one round of questioning for our panelists. If you would like to ask your question, please kindly indicate by raising your hands. But if you do have a question that has not been answered, perhaps as gone within the chat that had already been mentioned, please kindly just indicate again also by putting it on the chat or raising your hands to ask. I do see Elisha Manirampa, you have a question. Please kindly unmute your mic and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the last speaker, Prof. J.K. Bigon. He said that East Africa community hasn't done a critical role as compared with the West Africa community. So I'd like to find out, since East Africa community hasn't played a critical role to bring peace, justice, and accountability in Burundi, who else can make sure that justice and accountability that is in Burundi? Because, well, fine, he said that it depends on from one country to another to look back since when. Because if you look at the conflict of Burundi, it didn't start in 2015, even not even after independence. It's the thing that they start even before colonization, because there was some injustice whereby you found that Tutsi ethnic was ruling and undermining Hutu ethnic since when Burundi started, whereby they were denying them education and the key post in the government and so forth. So today, you see the conflict started long back in 1000 something 1200, because we found that is a king is a Tutsi, and they found that the people that after the king, all they were Tutsi, few they were Hutu. So since 1993 is when we introduced democracy, and then the same Tutsi that they were ruling the country since kingdomship, they killed the Hutu person. So now it's a kind of revenging. So that's why we are asking how and who can help Burundi to correct all those injustices that were being done. Because it's not today thing. Because now Africa Union, United Nations, they are pointing fingers because they are Hutu ruling. But after independence, up to 1993, nobody was making noise because they were Tutsi. So I'm saying, who can help and then make justice in Burundi? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question. I think it relates to justice and accountability. Of course, you had mentioned this within the Burundian context, but then also resonating much more critically at the global, at the regional level, much more broadly. If there are any other questions, please kindly put them in the chat box, just in case we've missed your question and you'd like our panelists to kindly answer your question. But then on this note, I would give the floor to, I think that question was directed to Dr. Jafet Bigon. And I'd just like to kindly give you the floor to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I'll go to what Dr. Walter Sama did mention in his response to questions of accountability, that of course there are many actors and stakeholders that we hope can intervene in country situations. But in the end, it's always the citizens' agency that really carry the day in terms of them demanding for justice. But also we have, I am really aware of some in many countries, including Burundi, that the space for citizens to exercise that agency is really limited and constrained. And therefore, we must also take into reality that in many instances, the pursuit for justice is really a very long-term pursuit, especially in relation to very grave, serious human rights violations. And therefore, you have to take that long-term view in terms of that pursuit. And just to give an example, we know that one of the greatest stories of pursuit of justice in Africa is the trial and conviction of Hisne Habre, former president of Chad. The crimes for which Hisne was charged and convicted were committed in the early 1980s, but it was not until 2015 that, not until the 2010s that really the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Senegal were established and the trial began and finally leading to conviction. It would have been, I would imagine, in the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, individuals who were pursuing justice in respect to those violations committed in 1990s, it would have seen that it was really, there were no prospects. They were almost impossible to pursue justice. But in the end, with resilience and continuing to push and advocate, the African Union did work with Senegal really establish the court, and then finally for the trial to take place. So two things really that I'm saying. One is its citizen agency, and two is really a long-term view, persistence and resilience in pursuing for justice and working with a wide range of stakeholders in that regard. Thank you, Romola.
Thank you very much, Dr. Japheth. And that was, I think that's an excellent summation of the pertinent points that you've made over the last presentations, also in light of the importance of really developing strong accountability measures and fostering justice. Thank you for that pertinent point. And on this note, I would like to, if there are no further questions, I would like to, I do see, okay, I've seen that there's a question that someone has raised up their hand. I think it's Reverend Matthew. I suppose you're the one with the Galaxy A2 core. I do also see Hassan Abdu. Please, if you could just kindly ask your question in about a minute and let us know, just mention your name and your organization. Tell us the panelists who you'd like to direct your question to, and then ask your question. Thank you. We'd start off with Reverend Matthew.
Once again, thank you. This very interesting topic. Following the response from Doctor, I just want to find out, can Africa Union or those agencies help to establish a truth and reconciliation process like in Burundi, where they can check whatever happened before, not just what happened recently, but maybe whatever happened before, all kind of human violation that took place before, and they come to a consensus where there will be a healing process. Can the African Union help in that, so that anyone who was involved in human rights violation doesn't escape or go from one country to another running from justice, but trying to bring the Burundian together so that they can be an opportunity for a healing process? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. We'll move on to Mr. Hassan. Hassan Habdu, you can unmute your mic and ask your question. Thank you. Mr. Hassan Habdu.
Hello, good afternoon from Somalia. Okay, my question is going to directly to Dr. Sama, who was briefing about Somalia issue, especially IDPs in Somalia and the African Union mission progress in Somalia. As we know, African Union mission in Somalia, especially the peace project in Somalia, it is operating in Somalia more than a decade, and when you look at the results that was produced by the international institutions like this institution called, if I remember the name correctly, IBON, they have found out that during a decade intervention in Somalia, that AMISOM will not be able to reduce the threat of insurgents in Somalia. And again, there was also a report that was produced by the U.S. Defense Department that they were evaluating their peace operations activities in Somalia, and they have concluded that despite air strikes and massive operations contributed by African Union and other...
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Hassan. Really sorry to interrupt you. Do you mind just perhaps speaking close to the microphone, because we can't really hear you?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that, and I'm so close to it. Can you hear me now?
Yes, better, yes.
So the other part, have you heard the other part that I was referring?
I think it would be good to start from the beginning because it was a bit more.
Okay. My question is going directly to Dr. Sama, who was briefing about Somalia situation and IDPs in Somalia. So according to the report that was produced by the U.S. Department of defense and an international institution that's called Hebron that also evaluates peace operations in Africa or globally. I mean, they have found out that despite many efforts to reduce the threat of insurgency in Somalia, they have concluded that there will not be a possibility that the threat will be reduced in Somalia. And AMISOM is operating in Somalia more than a decade. And according to the information from Mr. Samao, he was just referring some urban centers that they have liberated. But when you look at the other parts of the country or the surroundings of the urban centers that they have liberated, there are still the insurgencies operating and then doing their activities without fear. And according to the statistics that was produced globally today, it shows that the insurgencies are still able to alter their operations into collecting finances and enlarging their influence in Somalia. So I'm asking, is there any other possibility that they are going to refer to find a solution for Somalia? Because this current intervention is not making any progress. It's just prolonging the situation. So I'm asking Dr. Samoa, are there possibilities that they're thinking of, whether it is engaging with insurgencies with themselves to find a solution to Somalia, or they're just following this process that they are now following that's not bringing any solution to Somalia, because it is now more than 30 years that Somalia is not getting an effective institution or an effective government in Somalia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hassan. I'd just like to perhaps ask the Dr. Sama if you got that question, or if you'd like the question to be repeated, because I think it was a bit low at some point.
I got the question clearly. I did.
Awesome. Okay.
Okay.
Awesome. That's great. So I think, yes.
You want me to answer now?
Yes, you can go ahead, please.
All right. Yeah, I mean, thank you for the question. I mean, I can't remember your name, but really, I understand you from Somalia. And the question was a question I've got to receive from so many other people. You know, a lot of peacekeeping missions in Somalia since the 1990s, and Somalia is still a situation that needs the support of the international community. And the way you frame your question, clearly it's that which suggests that the solution to the Somali problem should come from outside. And meanwhile, as the African Union, as the UN, the international community, efforts have been to, encourage Somali leaders and peoples to take the lead in finding a solution to their own problem with support from the international community. So it should rather be the other way. The AU forces that deployed in Somalia in 2007, and if you look at the country then in 2007 and the country now, you will say that there has been a transformation from a failed state to what I can consider now as an emerging state. So this change is not just going to come overnight, and efforts have been made by the Somali leaders with the support of the African Union and the UN, EU, to bring Somalia to where it is today. So I would think that efforts should be made in Somalia to have more security forces that can help stabilize the country, because eventually peacekeepers would leave. And so they can be the only solution for a country. And you identified one problem, which is what almost every panelist has identified, the governance vacuum. If you ask many of the young people who are joining Al-Shabaab and conducting attacks against civilians, against state officials, they will tell you what they need is just, it's for their livelihood. It's really not about the ideology. And as AMISOM or as the AU forces, that's not something they can provide. They cannot provide governance. They cannot provide service delivery. They cannot do reconciliation. It has to be done by the people themselves. But of course, with the support of the AU. And what the AU is doing, as I indicated in my initial presentation, was just to create the conducive environment for Somalis to sit and reconcile and decide on their future. And I think that should be the way forward, because that's what, you know, ownership, national ownership and leadership of a peace building process requires. And this question, your question is very linked to the question Reverend, I think Matthias asked about Burundi. It's really not for the AU to just, you know, deploy itself in Burundi without the consent of the government. And if you could recall, a few years ago, there was an attempt by the African Union to deploy a peacekeeping mission in Burundi, and the government said no. What the AU decided then to do was to deploy human rights monitors who did an excellent job. And I'm sure their presence and the work they did in Somalia helped to save lives. But of course, we have all said that, you know, the AU and the UN, they are all clubs of sovereign states. And so their power is not, they can be more powerful than the sovereign states themselves. And this makes it very difficult to do intervention in countries without the consent of the host government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that excellent point that you've made, Dr. Walters. And on this note, I would like to also call upon Dr. Japhet Bigon. I think there was a question that was specifically directed to you. And also after you answer the question, I would like to perhaps in this particular order ask Dr. Halioni if there are final comments or thoughts that he would like to share with us. And then we would move on to Dr. Walters again, and we will end up with Dr. Bigon. So, but in this round, Dr. Bigon, please kindly respond specifically to the question. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Walters has already answered the question actually that was directed to me concerning Burundi. As he rightly indicates, on issues of transitional justice and the creation of a truth commission, you cannot have a top-down approach in terms of the AU demanding and imposing a truth commission. There must be a bottom-up approach with ownership of the countries, really saying that we need this in order to address our past. And if that decision has been reached and the process is undergoing, then the AU can come in to provide technical support and assistance. And we have seen this in the case of the Gambia, where the African Union Department of Political Affairs is immensely involved in providing technical advice in terms of the transitional justice policy framework. And actually the different roles of the actors, the state, the sub-regional institutions, the AU, are clearly indicated in that policy. And the concept of ownership is really one of the key principles of that policy, that the country itself must own, and the AU would play a coordinating, supporting role. That's what I would say on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Japhet, for that pertinent point. And I would, at this stage, like to call upon Dr. Alihoni for final words regarding the presentations, but then also perspectives you'd like to share with us going forward beyond 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. My internet is slightly weak, so I'm not putting my video because of that, but I apologize. Again, it was such an honor for me to join part of a community of my former university, and a very vibrant human rights community, and be a part of this important conversation on those who are displaced within their own countries. And of course, we tend always to talk about what governments can do, or international community, or UNHCR, or this organization, AU, or that. But I think the conversation needs also to change slightly. We have to collectively talk about what we can do collectively based on our complementary roles and comparative advantages and capacities. And I think this community of academic institutions and individuals, researchers and students and religious institution representatives, we need to collectively see what we can do on behalf of those who are displaced or support the African Union agenda. As the keynote speaker said, the African Union is complex, the United Nations system is complex, some of the bigger international organizations are complex, but we need to really be jointly working on addressing the challenge of forced displacement. I must mention in this regard the 2018 Global Compact on refugees, for instance, which was adopted universally by the General Assembly, which holds for a whole of society approach. The approach is not necessarily anchored in government or what they can do, but collectively what we and must do. In this regard, I heard even in the chat room, people really focusing on not just the norms, but implementation. Implementation. That's one of the key issue that I took. That's also our understanding, where we need to invest more resources, to really build data on IDPs, data on refugees, data on mixed migrant situations. We need to build the capacity of governments and also local actors, how to localize response. We need to really also call for collective advocacy. Sometimes, we just point out certain agency. Why are you not saying this? Why are you not speaking out? Why are we not all collectively speaking out? Why are we not working? And so I think that's the spirit in which, again, one of the most important issue for us is to make sure that this complex intergovernmental process have a space for IDPs, have a space for refugees and migrants. That's the biggest lesson we took from 2019 Team of the Year, and also the silencing of the guns agenda, which, interestingly, we were innovative. When we have more online conversation with the AU, it became easier to have refugees. And I must admit that. In fact, it was very easier. It was easier for us. And so learning from how we adapted, even our training possibility for the government online, I think we need to be more aggressive, engaging refugees and displaced. The system recognized the strategic role of the African Union and also the rights. In fact, we have two major frameworks. One is entirely dealing with peace and security issues, the other on SDGs and the Agenda 2063. That is a very strong endorsement of the role of the African Union in REX, and that's why we invest resources. I completely, I am a UNHCR staff, but embedded in the AU with the idea that we are supporting the AU, that we are working as UN and AU. And also, so that's a spirit in which, but of course, working partnership with NGOs and several actors, media, research, and think tanks. And with that, from my side, thank you very much once again, for inviting me to be a part of this crucial conversation. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aluni, for those pertinent points that you've made in summary, really excellent points. And I just want to re-emphasize that should you have missed on any of the insightful presentations by our distinguished panelists, please kindly go to the Center for Human Rights Platforms, as with the GENIDA African platforms as well, to have a rewatch of this pertinent presentations. And I just also like to state, just also leveraging on the pertinent point made around research on internal displacement, I'd like to indicate to our participants that the Global Engagement Network is an international collaboration on internal displacement. It is a network geared towards protection of internally displaced persons in Africa, and to be part of it and to be part of more critical analysis and research on internal displacement, please kindly register as an affiliate of the Global Engagement Network on internal displacement by going to the link that has been provided in the chat below. Thank you very much. And on this note, I'd like to kindly call on Dr. Walters Sama for his concluding remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's really been an exciting couple of hours having this conversation on such an interesting topic, and bringing together also very distinguished panelists and distinguished attendees as well. Just to conclude, I should say I think it's time to go beyond, just using the military or trying to find only a military solution to the issue of silencing the gun, because that's very limited and it's not durable. Emphasis should really be, building, democracy and governance. In other words, focusing on the SDGs, to as a way of proactively and progressively silencing the gun. That's really the most durable way we can do that, to build peace rather, using, all of this, rule of law mechanisms, mediation, separation of powers. Those are issues that are very important in African countries, rather than, constantly, resorting to the military option to, impose peace. That would require, mainstreaming peace building, even as we craft laws, even as we draft or redraft our constitutions. The peace building element should be there, because the constitution is one of the most important peace building tool we have. When it is when the peace building, silencing the gun principle is entrenched in those institutions and frameworks, I think that will really bring about a culture of peace. And to me, that will bring a lasting solution to, the violence and the armed conflicts we are having across the continent, which is triggering, the millions of internally displaced persons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Waters, for that pertinent summation as well. Very much appreciated. And on this note, I'd like to move on to Dr. Japhet Bigon.
Thank you. I think when it comes to questions of displacement, questions of conflict, as we have seen, it's easy to get despondent because of the slow, painstaking progress in terms of silencing the guns, but also stopping forced displacement of individuals, also in terms of pursuing justice and accountability. But I think it would be good to end in a good note, and I thought perhaps to mention one recent development in terms of progress on the continent. As you may know, under Article 14 of the Kampala Convention, state parties are required to submit reports to the African Charter in terms of Article 62 of the African Charter to the African Commission. And for the first time, we had the first report submitted by Cameroon 2 weeks ago, and it was reviewed by the African Commission. So it's the first after about 8 years of the Kampala Convention being enforced. But it's a progress that we hope that other countries. So I just want to mention that. Otherwise, it has really been an honor to be part of this exciting discussion and to be part of these distinguished panelists, including Alejón, that I'm happy to have seen here virtually. Thank you, Romola, for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dr. Japhet Bigon, for that excellent summation. And I must say that please, if you'd like to reach out to our panelists as well, kindly note that they are on social media platforms, Twitter, on Facebook, and they would love to engage with you as well. But if there's specific questions you'd like to also ask them, which probably you did not have the time to ask, given the limited time we had for this pertinent conversation, please also kindly feel free to send us a message and we'll be sure to connect you. And just to indicate that for Dr. Alioni Muligeta Baby, you can follow him on Twitter, very importantly, please, at Alehone, and that is at ALLEHONE. And also for Dr. Japhet Bigon is also on Twitter. You can follow him on at Bigon Japhet, that's at BIEGON Japhet, that's JAPHET. Kindly follow them as they also tweet very importantly around these issues that are of significance to the continent. And of course, if you like to reach out to Dr. Waters Sama, please do also kindly let us know as well, and we'll be sure to connect you with him as well. So thank you so much, and I must kindly appreciate everyone's presence. Thank you for the insightful comments. Thank you for the insightful questions as well. And thank you for the excellent participation in this event. On this note, I would like to Also thank our panelists for really taking out time from their really busy schedule. Like I can imagine, I know how they are really, really busy, but the fact that, they could really grace this occasion and present us with very significant insights is highly appreciated. From the Center for Human Rights and also the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement in Africa, we really like to thank you and say that we sincerely appreciate your presence, and we do hope to have you back very soon to have further discussions, given your excellent knowledge and expertise in these issues of focus within this context. And I also see that distinguished participants are also thanking you as well in the chat box. And we'd just like to also, I'd like to very kindly thank on the part of the Center for Human Rights, Ms. Yolanda Boyson, for really engaging with us. I suppose we've also received emails from her in recent times. And also very importantly, Ms. Tiruna Naidu for really pulling this together, even while she has been very critical at this particular meeting in terms of providing us with the much required support and the much needed assistance. Thank you so much, Ms. Tiruna, for your excellent time here and also for really pulling this together in such brilliant ways. On that note, from my side, I would really like to thank everyone again and say have a lovely, lovely afternoon. Please kindly feel free to be part of the Global Engagement Network on Internal Displacement by clicking on the link that has been provided. And we do hope that you keep safe and you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll definitely be in touch. Thank you so much.